So welcome back, class. We'll do a new poem today by Chinua Achebe. It's called Refugee Mother and Child. This poem assumes a lot of importance, especially from the post-colonial context. Uh, and not only that, the interesting coincidence is today also happens to be Chinua Achebe's birthday, that is 16th November, right? So added significance also. And this poem has its own imprint on post-colonial poetry in general because of various reasons. We'll just go into a few today as an introduction. See, this is something that we have done earlier when I was giving you an introductory lecture to language component in post-colonial studies. I gave you this wonderful definition that Chinua Achebe gives us about why he wants to write down his ideas, his thoughts. So here you find this was in an interview that he gave for the Paris Review in 1994, where he says, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. I repeat, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. That means, right, history has always been the record of the victor. So that's what Will Durant tells us in The Story of Philosophy. All history is the result of accumulated oppression, suppression, victimization. And so the history that we have today is the history of the victor, according to a theory in general, post-colonial studies in particular. And that's one reason why context becomes important for post-colonial studies. Maybe in the previous year, when we did a metaphysical poetry or other poetry, the context was not that important. The text alone was of primal importance for us, right? But that's because everything else was secondary to an analysis of the words or the text on the page. But here, the context becomes a core text, right? From a theoretical perspective. So this is a wonderful quote that you can cherish for life. Unless, remember, Derek Walcott says in his wonderful poem, I met history once, I'm just quoting, right? I met history once, but he ain't recognize me. Repeat, I met history once, but he ain't recognize me. That means I don't form a part of the history, right? That has been handed down to me. Ain't recognize me. What a shocking, sordid statement, right? That makes him think aloud about his place in history. So all the history that has been handed down has been the history of the victor, the golden age of the Queen Elizabeth, Jacobean, Caroline, all the kings. Where do I find a place? Where does my voice find a place? Right? The history of the voice, I think it's a 1984 text where Edward Kamau Brathwaite talks about nation language, where he says, I need my own English. I need my own, the style of English to represent myself, to tell my story. So the next one, this one, he says, my 3 reasons for becoming a writer. This was from the, an interview that he gave. For me, there are 3 reasons for becoming a writer, he says. The first one is that you have an overpowering urge to tell a story. Please have this these 3 points for life if you are planning to become a writer tomorrow, or when you want to write down a memoir, autobiography, or anything for that matter. Right? So storytelling begins in this way. Like, I have an overpowering urge to tell a story. And the second is, you have the information for a unique story waiting to come out. Just a minute, I'll start the timer. Start. Yeah. And the story should be unique, right? No one else has attempted such a story ever before. It should be unique. Unique in the sense, you could make it unique by your own life experiences, your own lived experiences, your own style, your own content, and the way you approach the story. Right? So unique story waiting to come out. And the final one, which you learn in the process of becoming, is that you consider the whole project worth the considerable trouble. So, this is more important. A great satisfaction that I have attempted to write down, right? Uh, the acme of all the four skills is writing, they say. So when I write down my story, it becomes, right, my voice, my tone, my identity. So this is the reason why he wants to become a writer. Now, just three quotations from Achebe on his birthday today to recollect what a mighty person he has been for us in postcolonial studies in particular. Art is man's constant effort to create for himself a different order of reality from that which is given to him, a higher reality that Aristotle tells us, right? A higher truth, a higher plane of reality, an ideal world, right? So that he has not altogether already witnessed, right? So from a different order of reality, from that which is given to him, nobody can. The second point, right? Nobody can teach me who I am. You can describe parts of me, but who I am and what I need is something I have to find out myself. You should not be telling me about me because I have to discover myself. Can you connect it to the previous poem that we discussed in class, Journey to the Interior by Margaret Atwood, where she says, I have to go within me to discover myself and I find it worth the trouble. Exactly what he says in the previous slide here, right? The last bullet point, could you see that? The third bullet point, you consider the whole project worth the considerable trouble. This is exactly what Margaret Atwood tells us in her Journey to the Interior, where she says, towards the end of this journey, right, she's so happy. In Journey of the Magi also you'll find, right, in the second stanza, it was quite satisfactory. So here, I have to find it out myself for the journey to attain fruition. And the last one, if you don't like someone else's story, write your own. What a beautiful concept, precept for life. If you don't like someone else's story, you can write your own. No one is preventing you. Because if there is a unique story waiting to come out, why do you want to rely on other stories? All human beings are basically storytellers, and we condition the little beautiful world that we live in through the stories that are told to us right from our childhood, right? And so if you don't like someone else's story, it's better you write your own, right? Next one. This is very important for us. The title of the book is There Was a Country. There Was a Country, a Personal History of Biafra by Chinua Achebe. This book is not very popular among Chinua Achebe's oeuvre. This book has not been very prominent among his entire writing output. But this book is very important to understand the psychological workings of the writer, why he was against the colonizers, right? Because this is something that connects with the text that we are planning to discuss, right? Refugee Mother and Child, a very important book of 300 odd pages. As I was reading through the book, I found a lot of interpolations into the poem also, because the poem also finds mention there in this wonderful text. So this particular text he talks about his early childhood experiences and how they shaped his thinking, although his parents, right, conditioned him in a very religious, pious Christian upbringing. He had to question a lot of credentials laid down by Christianity. The reason is because he says he was at the conflict or at the intersection of two cultures. This will be the next poem that we discuss by David Aberdeen. Sorry, A Far Cry from Africa by Derek Walcott. Two cultures again we have discussed, no, David Aberdeen's. The intersection of two cultures. Just imagine if you are a product of two cultures, right? An American and some other. or two cultures, any two nations or any two nationalities, just imagine, where would your loyalties be? Derek Walcott, in his Far Cry from Africa, he says, my loyalties are divided to the vein. Like to the vein. My loyalties are divided loyalties. Ambivalence is the output. Ambivalence means, right, two-sided. Ambi means, right, two. Or a hybrid individual. How is my identity affected in the process? And how will my language be when I am a product of two cultures? Chinua Achebe talks about this particular influence at the crossroads of two cultures. And so what comes out is, right, something new, or a judicious mix of both the cultures. That's why it is unique, right? So next one. This is from the book, right? I've just given you some snippets from this wonderful book. This is how it opens. The book opens like this, right? I'm just giving you the second paragraph there. It tells us about the pain of colonization, because it was called the Scramble for Africa. Africa was a land filled with gold, filled with a whole lot of minerals, plantations, everything. And so there was a scramble for Africa from all the European great powers. And this scramble for Africa, happened because of many reasons. And the one pact or agreement that happened in the year 1885 sealed it all, because Germany was becoming a superpower, and the first chancellor of Germany, Otto, O-T-T-O, right? He wanted to advance into African territory and win lands for himself. And so it was imperative for all these, colonizers, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, and all of them to come together, from Germany also, to come together and divide among themselves the African nation, right? So the spoils, they wanted to divide it among themselves without any representation or voice from the native African. Just a minute. Right. This is shocking, isn't it? So two things happened. He says, this is the introductory paragraph. You can read it when you are free, this particular book. The reign that beat Africa began 400 to 500 years ago from the discovery of Africa by Europe through the transatlantic slave trade. We all know the slave trade that happened 5 centuries ago. And the second one, he traces it to the Berlin Conference of 1885. A very important one, because the Berlin Conference, they divided, right, the territories in Africa among themselves, right? And this division of territories in Africa among themselves was based on their own imperial agendas. In post-colonial parlance, we have a word for that. It's called cartography. Cartography means map precedes territory, mapping of a land. Just imagine there is a huge, thousands of, kilometers of land ahead of you. Virgin soil, virgin territory waiting to be explored. You are a very powerful, nation, and a huge landscape, thousands and thousands of kilometers, is given to you on a platter. Now, what do? The people there are voiceless. Right? You have to first imagine, going back to the past. You are one of the first to explore, within quotes, this huge landscape. How will you do? First, the first instinct of the Westerner is the mapping instinct. Right? First, what they do is they want to map the place. That's why in Journey to the Interior, maps are of no consequence. How you cannot map us to know us, because mapping is instinctual for the Westerner. It's the Western impulse to map a place before venturing into a territory. So, they'll map a place like this and give their own sweet names for a particular native regional name. They'll replace it to their own name, because for administrative purposes. And so whenever they venture into territories, they always had this mapping instinct, which Edward Said calls imagined geographies. or otherwise called imaginative geographies. What Benedict Anderson would call, we have discussed this earlier, right? Imagined communities. Mapping precedes territory. Map precedes territory. So this mapping instinct was a strategy by the Westerner. They did not have a first-hand experience of the territory, but they mapped. That means mapping here becomes stereotyping. Without knowing anything about the indigenes, the aborigines, the First Nations, the Inuits, what I do is I write down something about them as savage, uncouth, uncivilized, barbaric, uncultured, lacking in taste, refinement, manner. So I have to go there. And what happens usually is the cartographer is usually a part of the explorer. So an explorer will go on a backpack to these through these territories, African territories. The cartographer will usually accompany her. And what happens is when they go on this journey, from the behest of the imperial masters, they will not go into all the territories, right? Wherever the local guide takes them, because everywhere you'll have local guides. Wherever the local guides in Chinua Achebe's stories, you'll find these local guides. They act as translators also. Right? Wherever the local guides take you, you go there. And the local guide, whatever he tries to tell you or she tries to tell you, you accept it. You will believe it. See the representation here. One local guide who will act as an interlocutor between you and the native. So whatever the local guide tells you, you believe in it, and you will write it down. The cartographer immediately maps the place even as you write it down. So what happens is a representation happens here that is not at all in connect with the real, and this representation immediately gains a lot of validity and parlance, and it is carried over to all parts of the world that yes, this land, and some places say this place is filled with cannibals, savage, whole lot of things. We believe it to be true. We call it a stereotype. A stereotype is something that circulates over a period of time because of constant repetition. Map making instinct, we call it. That's why, in post-colonial studies, mapping is always interrogated. Because the naming that they give in the maps is highly Westocentric also. The names of the places that they give in the maps. Even the word Nigeria, given to, Nigeria, that country, Nigeria, was a name given by the Westerner. Because of the Niger River. Niger River again gets its name from a Westocentric perspective. It was, and the division also that happened, these demarcations of places that happened because of the colonizers' influx was again based on a Western paradigm, not because of the native paradigms, right? The natives or the locals were not taken into consideration at all, right? This was the controversial gathering of the world's leading European powers precipitated what we now call the Scramble for Africa. You can key in Scramble for Africa in that wonderful book also. You will find a whole lot of things that he has mentioned. It is shocking. It is harrowing, right? Which created new boundaries that did violence to Africa's ancient societies and resulted in tension-prone modern states. So it took place without African consultation. That's more important. That's why I've given it in blue. It took place without African consultation or representation. I'm just verbatim giving you his words, all his words in this entire page from that particular book, right? See the analogy that he gives. Great Britain was handed the area of West Africa that would later become Nigeria, like a piece of chocolate cake at a birthday party. So at the Berlin, Pact in 1885, each nation, superpower or colonizer, waiting to colonize the state, the Scramble for Africa, they were given chunks and chunks of African territory. And see the analogy that he uses. Great Britain was handed the area of West Africa that would later become Nigeria. So see how the name also changes, right? West Africa that would later become Nigeria, like a piece of chocolate cake at a birthday party. So without any representation from the natives. Just imagine you belong to a particular place, you belong to this land, your ancestors have been cultivating this land, worshipping this land, respecting this land for not years and years, not decades and decades, for centuries and centuries, like we find in Thomas King's short story Borders, centuries. And one fine day, when you are a part of your own soil, somebody without your knowledge sells your land to somebody else. How will you feel? What will be a response? Without your knowledge, one fine day, you find that your land, in which you have been dwelling for hundreds of years along with your ancestors, has been handed down like a piece of chocolate cake at a birthday party to some other nation. Nations that don't have any connect with the soil, they meet at Berlin and they decide among themselves to share your soil. How dare this share? Right? So that's what happens here. And this is the angst that Chinua Achebe, that's why I told you, post-colonial poetry, you will find an angst, a grievance. It is not a celebration of some peace or something. It is the angst at the intersection of two cultures and the pain wrought about by colonization, not only somatic means body, but also on psychosomatic, you can call it, right? But also on the mind. That's why Ngugi wa Thiong'o tells us, decolonize the mind. Now, see the beautiful descriptions. I'm not going to describe all those things here. Just for a screenshot I've taken from the book, you can screenshot it to see how fertile and how beautiful the lands originally were in Nigeria. See the descriptions that he gives. The northern part of Nigeria was the seat of several ancient kingdoms. Glorious Nok Kingdom, world-renowned terracotta sculptures. The Oyo and Life kingdoms once strode majestically. See the flourished, nourished, cherished, thrived. All beautiful analogies for how the place was until things started falling apart with the arrival of the colonizer. So the reason for the Biafran War is given here, right? And the Biafran War is important because the poem that we are discussing, Refugee Mother and Child, concerns the Biafran War, where the people there became refugees in their own soil. So indirect rule in Igbo land proved far more challenging to implement in Igbo soil because the modus operandi that the Westerners advocated here was completely different. They did not know how to administer the land. The natives had their own variety, right, of administration, their own paradigms, models of administration. But once the Western onslaught came in, they had a different mode of administration, which was completely chaotic. And the people did not know how to be how to be a subject. Now, there is pandemonium, there is chaos in the soil. But unfortunately, the Westerner did not know what to do now. They were helpless also, because they have now completely made the people dispossessed, divided the lands, given it like a birthday chocolate cake at a birthday party to everyone. So without any local representations or voices being listened to, now there is chaos. Now look at this. A whole war, a civil war, a local war, happened of huge proportions. Lakhs and lakhs of people died of starvation, like the Bengal famine we had in India, right? Years back, say decades back. Lakhs and lakhs of people died in starvation, right? Because of the land blockade that happened. If you can just go back even into a couple of months back and see what happened in a lot of nations, right? Because of the pandemic that struck a whole lot of nations across the world, the blockades that happened, and because of the land blockades, the road blockades, people could not go to their own land and they were made refugees in their own land. Something similar to that. When a road blockade happens, what happens is people are not able to go. Movement of goods is scuttled. So food cannot be consumed. People require food. And if road blockades are there, food cannot come into territory. Not one day, not 2 days. Just imagine your whole area, the food movement stops. The lorries that bring food, right? The container lorries, the trains, the goods carriages, the freight lorries that bring food to us. All the roads are blocked. How many days can we survive? We can't survive for long, isn't it? How many days? This Biafran war resulted in such food blockades all across this territory. And what happened was people began to starve. They did not have access to good food. All food movement was stopped. Like we can easily, look back on how the pandemic time, there was road blockades and all across the world. And because of that, how movement of food was affected. And in the United States, especially, how, the basic essential for them, the toilet paper was in great demand. It sold like, for a premium, we are told, right? Short supply. Food was in short supply. Milk, bread, everything was in short supply. The same happens here. So, colonial rule functioned through a newly created and incongruous establishment of warrant chiefs. These warrant chiefs were a kind of an ambassadors or interlocutors between the Western colonial masters and the locals. Right? A deeply flawed arrangement that effectively confused and corrupted the Igbo democratic spirit. So, this is the last line. I'll just give you the last line here. In my view, it was a cataclysmic experience that changed the history of history of Africa. Right. So see the glorious past that he ruminates or thinks about. Right. Like Torudat says, "Now our cashew in a tree." Kamalada says, "My grandmother's house." Right. So my Africa. Michael Deyanang says, "No, Africa speaks. My Africa." Right. So most members of my generation who were born before Nigeria's independence remember a time when things were very, very different. This line is very important because it helps us connect with the poem also, where he talks about these two, right? The present and the past. He goes back to the past when things were completely different. Nigeria was once a land of great hope and progress, a nation with immense resources at its disposal. Natural resources, yes, but even more so, human resources. But the Biafran War changed the course of Nigeria. And who was responsible for the Biafran War? The Westerner. Now, with the Cold War, with the Civil War in Biafra, the Westerner doesn't know how to mediate. Now, they have conveniently escaped. Why the Biafran War happened? What was the reason for the Biafran War? Because of the division of Nigeria into territories, map preceding territory by the Westerner. Now they have left the place, and Biafrans, the locals, suffer the devastation. Right? In my view, right, it was a cataclysmic experience that changed the history of Nigeria. That there is some connection between the particular distress of war, right? You can connect this better, right? If you want to talk about the pandemic from your own perspective, you could write it down because we have experienced firsthand or experienced live, right? A pandemic which not many generations have witnessed, right? The corona pandemic. And how many months, even till now, we are not able to meet in real-time classes since March 25th. You guys didn't even write your exams after that. Couldn't write your real-time exams after that. Everything became online after that. like the partition period. You have Bapsi Sidhu or Kushwant Singh or a whole light of partition writers. They witnessed firsthand the trauma, the horrors of partition. They were able to write it down. Similarly, Achebe witnessed firsthand the conflict of the civil war that happened in Nigeria, 1967 to 1970, and he was for the Biafran independence, the Republic of Biafra. You can key it out on Google and look at it when you are free, right? The Republic of Biafra. That is why he says, no, there was a country. So that was his ideal land. So there is some connection between the particular distress of war, the particular tension of war, and the kind of literary response it inspires. Most of us have done that, right? The horrors of a pandemic, we have tried to translate it into poems, into stories, into movies. A whole lot of movies came up based on the pandemic. Poetic responses have come up. Even memes, comic memes came up. Literary responses as a result of, right, a distress. How is it? And he says the literary response that I wanted to give was not as like a story, but it was poetic. The literal response that I wanted to give was poetic. That's why he says in the first point here, I chose to express myself in that period through poetry as opposed to other genres. So these are the two collections that he came up with. Some of you must have also written down poems on the pandemic that we are witnessing right now every day. Thousands are dying because of this devastating pandemic now. So we can beautifully connect with the horrors or the devastation of a similar incident, but on a different proportion. Starvation happened then also. So my Biafran poems and other poetry are collected in 2 volumes. Beware Soul Brother poems and then collected poems. 2 volumes of poetry is written based on the Biafran experience. And Refugee Mother and Child belongs to one such collection. We'll discuss that right in the next class. As a group, these poems tell the story of Biafra's struggle and suffering. This particular book, it is about this particular book. So you're not going to the last point. So why does he want to share the story of Biafran independence? In 1964, if you can remember, Biafra happened in 1967. In 1964, if you would remember, or if you go back into the history of Tamil Nadu, you'll find there was a glorious place called Dhanushkodi down south, which was washed away by a huge cyclone that happened. Even there was a train going, down the railroad, which was also washed away in the floods. And until date, most of Dhanushkodi remains submerged, right? 1964, if I'm right. So, it was 1964. There were many writers who wrote novels and stories and poems on the, that horrible night that happened in Dhanushkodi when a whole town became submerged because of the cyclone, right? 1964. A train with passengers, that was going was also washed away, right? Because of the cyclone. A devastation which resulted in a whole lot of movies, stories, poems that came up after that. Similarly here, right? Why does he write it down for posterity? I'll connect it with Derridian archives because Derrida says the archives are filled with violence. Derek Walcott says, I met history once, but history doesn't recognize me. Foucault says, power and knowledge are always connected. Archaeology of knowledge, right? So here, he says, it is for the sake of the future of Nigeria, for our children and grandchildren, that I feel it is important to tell Nigeria's story, Biafra's story, our story, my story, right? So it is my story, it is our story, it is Biafra's story. So from the particular, he wants to go into the particular. And see the year, this is the first chapter that he writes, the title of the chapter is The Magical Years, where he was born. See how he starts. On November 16, 1913, in Nobi, near my hometown of Ogidi, Providence ushered me into a world at a cultural crossroads. I told you, no, the intersection of cultures, right? At a cultural crossroads. By then, a long-standing clash of Western and African civilizations had generated deep conversations and struggles between their respective languages, religions, and cultures. This was the clash that was happening. The next line, his own words, verbatim. Crossroads possess a certain dangerous potency, right? Vigor. That's why Edward Kamau Brathwaite uses the analogy of the hurricane, a potency. Crossroads possess a certain dangerous potency. This potency, when it translates into literary form, what happens is, it has the power of a hurricane. That's why he says, we are tigers. Who says that? Right, Ole Soinka. Here, Chinua Achebe says we are lions. We roar. We have our own potency, vigor in our writing. So don't expect us to be, very mellifluous or romantic in our poems, because our poems have a potency in the language. The same Chinua Achebe says, dismantling the master's house using the master's tools. What is the tool? The English language. Strategies that he uses in his poetry, in his prose, in his novels, they are potent tools that Bill Ashcroft would call empire writing back. Empire writing back with potency, with vigor and rigor. And please remember this line, right? When you recollect Chinua Achebe's writing, you should remember this is from his wonderful book, There Was a Country, right? Crossroads possess a certain dangerous potency. Crossroads could also mean, Homi Baba uses the word ambivalence. He uses the word hybridity, resulting in mimicry. So we'll stop there. Yeah, we'll stop there for now. You can do some cursory reading on this particular text, and then you can also do some reading on the poem, and we'll continue in the next class. Thank you. Have a good day.